They mocked the orphan for inheriting 70 acres of wasteland, until he found the bunker beneath. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, you know this feeling. The whole world feels like a door shutting behind you, and another one, locked and rusted, standing in front of you. Hit that subscribe button if you get what I mean, because this story is for you. It's about what happens when the one thing everyone tells you is worthless turns out to be the only thing that matters. My 18th birthday started the same way the last 6,574 days of my life had, with a fluorescent light humming over a linoleum floor. The state of California had owned me since I was 3. It fed me, clothed me, and housed me in a series of buildings that all smelled faintly of bleach and quiet desperation. Now, on the morning I officially became an adult, it was showing me the door. The feeling wasn't freedom. It was like being pushed out of an airlock. 2 duffel bags held everything I owned. One held clothes that were either too big or too small, donated by people I'd never met. The other held a handful of worn paperbacks, a sketchbook, and a photograph of a woman I barely remembered, my grandmother, Elena. A final meeting was required, a bureaucratic sign-off on my existence. I was led into the office of Ms. Albright, my case manager for the last 2 years. She was a woman who seemed permanently braced against a strong wind, her shoulders tight, her smile a thin, practiced line. Her office was a beige box, decorated with the kind of motivational posters that are profoundly unmotivating. "Hang in there," said a kitten dangling from a branch. I felt more like the branch. "Leo," she said, gesturing to the stiff chair opposite her desk. "Happy birthday." It sounded less like a celebration and more like a diagnosis. "Thanks." I sat, placing my bags by my feet. They made a soft, defeated sound on the carpet. "So, this is it. You're officially aged out." She shuffled papers, a ritual I'd seen 100 times. It was the adult way of avoiding eye contact. "You have your final check from the Transitional Housing Fund, your ID, your Social Security card." She ticked items off a list, her pen making sharp, definitive marks. "We've gone over the resources available. Shelters, job placement programs. You have the pamphlets." I nodded. The pamphlets were in my bag, already crinkled. They promised a world of opportunity that felt as distant as the moon. I was prepared for this part, the gentle push into a life I was supposed to build from scratch. What I wasn't prepared for was the pause. Ms. Albright put down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. For the first time, she looked at me directly, and her eyes were tired, but held something other than professional detachment. It looked like pity. "There's one other thing, Leo," she said slowly. "It's unusual. We were contacted by a law firm last month. It concerns your grandmother, Elena Rojas." My breath caught in my throat. Elena, the woman in the photo, her smile warm and her eyes dark and kind. She'd been my guardian for the first 3 years of my life, a hazy, sun-drenched memory of lullabies in a language I no longer spoke and the smell of baking bread. Then she was gone. A sudden illness, they told me. After that, the system. I hadn't heard her name spoken by an official in 15 years. My grandmother? When she passed, she had no assets, or so we thought. She had a will, but it was to be held in trust until you turned 18. It seems she left you something. Ms. Albright slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. It was old, the paper soft and yellowed at the edges. My name was written on the front in a looping, elegant script I recognized from the back of the photograph. My hands trembled as I took it. It felt impossibly heavy. What is it? It's a deed, she said, her voice flat, to a piece of property in Northern California, near a town called Shale Pass. I stared at her. Property. The word didn't compute. Kids like me didn't inherit things. We were the things left behind. She also left this. Ms. Albright pushed a smaller envelope toward me. Inside was a stack of cash, a few $100s, worn and soft, and a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key. The law firm said this was for your travel and initial expenses. The key, well, they didn't know what it was for. Presumably a lock on the property. I opened the large envelope. The legal jargon was dense, but the words that jumped out were 70 acres. 70 acres. It was a number so vast I couldn't picture it. My entire world had been measured in square feet, the size of a bedroom shared with 3 other boys, the length of a hallway, the perimeter of a concrete yard. Ms. Albright cleared her throat, pulling me from my daze. Now, Leo, I need to be realistic with you. I looked into it. The property is remote, very remote. The county assessor's office values it at almost nothing. It's undeveloped, rocky, and has no utility access. The back taxes were paid by the trust, but going forward, that's on you. Frankly, it sounds more like a liability than an asset. A liability. I looked down at my grandmother's handwriting. It was a signature, a final flourish of a life I never got to know. A liability. The boys at the home would have laughed. Orphan Leo inherits a pile of rocks. There's an offer, though, she added, almost as an afterthought. A development corporation, Viridian Terra, has a standing offer to buy that entire parcel. They've been trying to acquire land in that valley for years. The offer is for $15,000. $15,000. To me, it might as well have been $1 million. It was a car. It was a security deposit and a year's rent. It was a future. It was the smart choice, the logical move. Anyone would say so. Sell the useless land, take the money, and start a real life. You don't have to decide now, Ms. Albright said, her voice softening. But it's an option, a good one, maybe your best one. I tucked the deed and the key back into the envelope. I could feel the weight of the cash in my pocket. $15,000. It was a clean break, a chance to erase the past and buy a new beginning. But as I looked at the envelope, at the name my grandmother had written with such care, another feeling crept in. It wasn't a liability. It wasn't an asset. It was a message. It was the last thing she ever gave me. I want to see it, I said, the words surprising me as much as they did her. Ms. Albright blinked. Leo, it's a 3-day bus ride. There's barely a town there. What are you going to do? I want to see it, I repeated, my voice firmer this time. I stood up, hoisting my duffel bags. The weight felt different now. It wasn't just the burden of my past anymore. It was the weight of a choice. She sighed, a long, weary gust of air. All right, Leo, it's your life now. She stood and offered a brief, awkward handshake. Her hand was cool and dry. Good luck. I walked out of the office, down the bleached hallway, and past the kitten poster. The automatic doors slid open, and the bright, smoggy California sun hit my face. For the first time in my life, there was no one telling me where to go. I had a key I didn't understand, a deed to a pile of rocks, and a choice. Sell it and be sensible, or go and stand on the one piece of the earth that was mine. I walked toward the bus station, the brass key heavy in my pocket like a stone, or maybe an anchor. The bus ride north was a slow, grinding transition from one world to another. The first day was all concrete and sprawl, the endless suburbs of Los Angeles bleeding into the agricultural flatlands of the Central Valley. The bus was filled with people in transit, each of us suspended between a place we'd left and a place we hoped to find. I sat by the window, watching the landscape change, feeling the vibrations of the road in my bones. The city I had always known, the only home I'd ever had, receded behind me like a bad memory. I didn't feel sad to see it go. I just felt empty. The bus smelled of stale air and processed food, the quiet hum of dozens of private anxieties packed into a single, moving container. It wasn't so different from the group home, really. I spent most of the time looking at the photograph of Elena. Her face was creased with laugh lines, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She was standing in front of a small house with a porch, a place I couldn't remember at all. On the back, in that same elegant script, it said, "Mi querido Leo, siempre." My dear Leo, always. I'd had a social worker translate it for me years ago. It was a promise I didn't understand from a ghost I barely knew. Now, holding the deed, I wondered if this land was part of that promise. By the second day, the landscape began to buckle and rise. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to the sharp, pine-covered shoulders of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The sun seemed sharper. We climbed higher and higher, the bus groaning on the inclines. The other passengers thinned out at each small town, replaced by fewer and fewer people, their faces weathered and quiet. I was moving away from the center of things, heading toward the margins. On the morning of the third day, the driver called out, "Shale Pass, next and final stop." I was the only one left on the bus. I gathered my bags and walked to the front. The driver, a man with a thick gray beard and a kind, tired face, looked at me in the rearview mirror. "You sure this is your stop, son?" he asked. "Not much here." "I'm sure," I said. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a single building that served as the town's general store, post office, and bus station. The town of Shale Pass wasn't really a town. It was a handful of buildings clinging to the side of a mountain road, looking like they might slide into the canyon below if a strong wind blew. A gas station with pumps from a bygone era stood opposite the store. A few houses were visible further up the winding road. That was it. I stepped off the bus, and the silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't just quiet. It was a deep, profound silence, filled with the sound of wind whistling through pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk. The air was cold and smelled of dust and pine needles. The bus pulled away with another hydraulic hiss, leaving me alone in a cloud of diesel fumes that quickly vanished into the clean mountain air. I was utterly, completely alone. I went inside the general store. A bell chimed. The interior was dark and cool, packed to the rafters with everything from canned goods and fishing lures to flannel shirts and motor oil. An older woman with sharp blue eyes and braided white hair sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. She looked up as I entered, her expression neutral but assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for a piece of land," I said, my voice sounding small. "It's off Ridgeback Road." I unfolded the deed, the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet store. She glanced at the name on it. "Rojas property," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Haven't heard that name in a long time. You family?" "She was my grandmother," I said. The woman's expression softened, just a fraction. "I'm Sarah. My family's run this store for 50 years. I remember Elena. Came in here now and then. Quiet woman, kept to herself." She looked me over again. "You got her eyes." The simple statement landed in my chest like a physical blow. In 18 years, no one had ever told me I had someone else's eyes. I was always just Leo, a file in a cabinet, a name on a list. Suddenly, I was connected to something, to someone. "How do I get there?" I asked, folding the map. "Ridgeback's about a 5-mile walk up that road," she said, pointing out the window. "Pavement ends after 2. It's rough going. The property itself, well, it's just land. Nothing on it but a little old lined shack. Been empty for 15, maybe 20 years. She paused. "You planning on staying?" "I'm just looking." She nodded slowly. "There's a development company been sniffing around here, Viridian, sending letters to everyone, offering money for land nobody wanted for a century. You'll probably hear from them." She leaned forward slightly. "Just be careful, kid. That land's been sitting quiet for a reason." The warning hung in the air between us. I bought a map of the area, a few bottles of water and some dried fruit, the last of the cash from my grandmother's envelope dwindling. I thanked Sarah and stepped back out into the sharp sunlight. 5 miles. I adjusted the straps of my duffel bags, the weight seeming to settle more deeply into my shoulders, and started walking up the road. The pavement gave way to a deeply rutted dirt track, just as Sarah had said. The trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead, plunging the road into a cool green twilight. The silence was broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel and my own ragged breathing. The air was thin up here, and the climb was steep. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faded, hand-painted sign nailed to a tree. Ridgeback Road. I had arrived. The property was a wall of green, indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. I followed the boundary line from the map, pushing through thickets of manzanita and thorny bushes. The land was exactly as Ms. Albright had described it, steep, rocky, and unforgiving. It was a vertical landscape, a jagged piece of mountain that seemed to have no purpose at all. Why would Elena buy this? What could she possibly have seen in this brutal, untamed place? Disappointment began to set in, cold and heavy. This was a mistake. I should have taken the money. After nearly an hour of searching, I found it. Tucked into a small, relatively flat clearing and half swallowed by overgrown bushes was a small shack. It was more of a cabin, really, but it was in a sorry state. The roof sagged in the middle, the porch steps had rotted through, and the windows were boarded up. It looked like it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. This had to be the line shack Sarah mentioned. I approached it cautiously. The air around it was still and heavy. With a surge of anticipation, I pulled the old brass key from my pocket. It looked ancient, like something from a fairy tale. I scraped away the grime and cobwebs from the keyhole on the heavy wooden door. I slid the key in. It resisted, then turned with a loud, grating click that echoed in the silence. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, opening into a dark, musty space. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was a single room. A thick layer of dust covered everything, sparkling in the thin shafts of light that pierced the boarded-up windows. There was a simple wooden bed frame with a rotted mattress, a small table with one chair, and a rusted wood-burning stove in the corner. A few empty shelves lined one wall. It was the Spartan, lonely room of a hermit. I dropped my bags, my hopes sinking with them. This was it. This was my inheritance, an empty, decaying box on a worthless piece of land. The trip was a fool's errand. I should call the number for Viridian Terra, sell it, and never look back. I sat on the edge of the dusty bed frame, the springs groaning in protest. I felt the familiar sting of foolishness, of hoping for something that wasn't there. But then my eyes caught something. On the floor, beneath the table, the dust was disturbed. Not by animals. It was a perfect scuff mark, as if something had been dragged. I knelt down, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I ran my hand over the rough wooden floorboards. Most were nailed down tight, but one, directly under the table, felt different. It was slightly loose. My fingers found a small notch on its edge. I pulled. It resisted, then lifted. It wasn't a floorboard. It was the lid of a shallow, hidden compartment. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was not money, not a weapon, but a book. A leather-bound journal. And beneath it, a rolled-up set of architectural drawings, tied with a faded ribbon. My hands were shaking as I lifted them out. I opened the journal. The first page was in my grandmother's handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. It was filled with dates, measurements, and notes. Geological survey complete. Excavation phase 1. Reinforced concrete pour. They were construction notes. I unrolled the drawings. They weren't for the shack. They depicted something vast, complex, and subterranean. There were multiple levels, ventilation systems, water purification schematics, power generators. At the top of the page, in bold block letters, was the title, The Archive, Project Sanctuary. My eyes scanned the drawing for the location, for the entrance. A small X was marked on the map, about 200 yards north of the shack, near a distinctive cluster of granite boulders. Underneath the X were 2 words, Pry Open. It wasn't a shack on a worthless piece of land. It was a gatehouse. This whole time, I hadn't been standing on my inheritance. I had been standing on top of it. A cold thrill, a mixture of fear and awe, shot through me. My grandmother hadn't left me a pile of rocks. She had left me a secret, and I was about to dig it up. I left the shack, the journal and blueprints clutched in my hand, and headed north, my earlier despair replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. I found the cluster of granite boulders, exactly where the map indicated. They were huge, ancient stones, covered in moss and lichen. I searched the area, my eyes darting everywhere, looking for a seam, a handle, anything. Nothing. It was just a jumble of rocks and earth. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was just a fantasy, the crazy dream of an old woman. But the blueprints were too detailed, the journal too specific. I looked again at the note, Pry Open. I searched the base of the largest boulder and found what I had missed before. A thin, almost invisible line in the dirt. A perfect semicircle of iron, rusted to the color of the earth. It was the edge of a handle, set flush into what looked like a solid metal plate, camouflaged with dirt and rock. I spent the next hour digging around it with my bare hands and a sharp rock, my fingers raw and bleeding. Slowly, I exposed a large, circular steel hatch, at least 4 feet in diameter. It was immense, solid, and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I wedged my fingers under the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. I put my whole body into it, my feet slipping in the loose dirt, my muscles screaming in protest. It was sealed tight. Defeated, I slumped against the rock. It was hopeless. Whatever was down there was locked away for good. Then I remembered the wood-burning stove in the shack. Attached to it was a set of iron tools, a poker, a shovel, and a long, heavy pry bar. I ran back to the shack, grabbed the pry bar, and returned to the hatch. The end of the bar fit perfectly into the space beneath the handle. I put a small rock under it for leverage, took a deep breath, and threw my entire weight onto the end of the bar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning screech of protesting metal, something gave. A seal broke. A puff of stale, ancient air hissed out, smelling of dust and contained time. With my heart pounding in my chest, I heaved the bar again. The hatch moved, slowly at first, then with increasing ease. It was counterweighted. I was able to lift it vertically, the heavy steel door rising to reveal a dark, circular shaft leading straight down into the earth. A steel ladder was bolted to the side. I stood at the edge, peering into the blackness. This was it, the point of no return. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to sell the land, to take the $15,000 and forget any of this ever existed. This was not normal. This was dangerous. But the thought of my grandmother, of the promise in her photograph, of the careful, secret work she had done, pushed me forward. This was my history, waiting for me in the dark. I checked the flashlight on my phone, almost full battery, took one last look at the sky, and swung my legs over the edge. My boots found the first rung of the ladder. It was cold and solid. I started to climb down, leaving the sunlit world behind, descending into the heart of my grandmother's secret. The descent felt endless. The circular shaft was concrete, smooth and cold. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of earth and ozone, the smell of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. My phone's light cut a weak, trembling circle in the profound darkness. I must have climbed down 50 feet, maybe more, before my feet touched a solid floor. I was in a small, circular concrete room. In front of me was a single, heavy steel door, like something you'd see on a bank vault. It had a large wheel in the center. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the wheel with both hands and turned. It was stiff, but it moved. With a series of deep, satisfying clicks, the bolts retracted. I pulled the door open. It swung silently, perfectly balanced. The air that flowed out was cool, dry, and clean. I stepped through the doorway and my jaw dropped. I wasn't in a bunker. I was in a home. It was a large, open living space, furnished with simple but comfortable-looking chairs and a sofa, all covered in white dust cloths. There were bookshelves lining one entire wall, filled with books. A compact kitchen area was tucked into one corner, its stainless steel appliances gleaming faintly in my light. It was dusty, silent, and perfectly preserved, like a museum exhibit of a life that had suddenly stopped. It was spacious and felt safe. The silence here wasn't empty, it was peaceful. I walked through the space in a daze, my light dancing across the room. I touched the back of a chair, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books. They were classics of literature, history, science, philosophy. This was a library for a lifetime of learning. There were doors leading off the main room. The first opened into a bedroom. It was simple, with a neatly made bed, a small desk, and a closet. It was Elena's room. On the desk was a framed photograph. It was the same one I had, of her standing on the porch. But this one was part of a larger picture. Standing next to her were a man and a woman, young, smiling, with their arms around each other. The woman had my grandmother's eyes. The man had my chin, my brow. They were holding a baby, me. My parents. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly weak. I had never seen a picture of them before. The system had no records, no photos. They were just names on a form, deceased. Now, here they were, real and vibrant and happy. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to stream down my face. I cried for the first time since I was a small child, a deep, ragged grief for the family I had lost twice, once in reality and once again in memory. After a long time, I wiped my eyes and continued to explore. Another door led to a second bedroom, smaller and clearly meant for a child. There was a small bed, a chest of drawers, and a shelf of children's books. It was my room, a room I had never slept in. My grandmother hadn't just built a bunker. She had built a home for us, a place where she intended for us to live together, hidden and safe. The last door was different. It was heavier, with a keypad lock next to it. But the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into an office. This room was the heart of the entire complex. It was lined with filing cabinets, computer terminals from the late 90s, and shelves stacked high with bankers' boxes. On a large central table, one box was open. Inside, I saw stacks of paper, videotapes, and cassette tapes. On top of the pile was a single, thick envelope. My name was on it. For Leo. My hands shook as I picked it up. This was it. The reason for all of this. I sat down in the dusty office chair, took a deep breath, and broke the seal. Inside were a dozen pages filled with my grandmother's beautiful, precise handwriting, and a small cassette tape. I looked at the desk and saw a small cassette player. I pushed the tape in, pressed play, and leaned back to read as her voice, a voice I only knew from the faintest edges of my memory, filled the silent room. It was slightly accented, warm and steady. "My dearest Leo," the letter began, and her recorded voice spoke the words along with me. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found your way home. I am so sorry, my love. I am sorry for the life you have had to live. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman who made a terrible choice for what she thought were the right reasons. There is so much you do not know. You do not know about your parents, and you do not know about this place. It is time you learned the truth. Your mother, my daughter, was also named Elena. She was a journalist, a brilliant, fearless one. Your father, David, was an environmental scientist. They were a perfect match, two people who believed the world could be made better. They fell in love, they got married, and then they had you. You were the light of their lives. They were working on a story together, an investigation. Your father had discovered that a powerful corporation, Viridian, was illegally dumping toxic industrial waste in poor rural communities, poisoning the water table. He had the proof: soil samples, water tests, internal company documents that were leaked to him by a whistleblower. My Elena, your mother, was writing the exposé that would bring them down. They knew it was dangerous. Viridian was and is a ruthless company. They had a history of silencing people. Your parents took precautions. They made copies of all their evidence. They told me everything. They told me that if anything happened to them, I was to take you and the evidence and disappear. They made me promise. And then something happened. They were driving back from a meeting with their source. A car accident. A truck that lost its brakes on a mountain road. That's what the police report said. But I knew it wasn't an accident. Viridian had found them. They were silenced. I was devastated, Leo. My world fell apart. But I had my promise, and I had you. The first thing I did was take their evidence, the original files, and hide it. Then I took you. I knew Viridian would come looking. They would want the evidence, and they would want to make sure the family line was ended. They couldn't have the son of the people they murdered growing up to seek justice. So I ran. I changed our names. I used the life savings your parents had left for you, and I bought this land. On paper, it was worthless. No one would ever look for us here. It was remote, unwanted, perfect. And while we lived in that little shack above, I used the rest of the money to build this place beneath our feet. I hired contractors in secret, one at a time, paying in cash. I told them it was a wine cellar, a storm shelter. No one ever knew the full scope of it. It took 2 years. This place, the archive, was built to be our sanctuary. A place where you could grow up safe, where I could teach you, where we could live. And a place to protect your parents' work until the world was ready for it. But they found me, or they were getting close. I don't know how. Maybe a financial trail, a lucky guess. I started seeing unfamiliar vehicles on the road. I got a letter, an offer to buy the land from a shell company I knew belonged to Viridian. It was a warning. They were sniffing around. I knew they would find us, and if they found us together, they would take you. I was faced with an impossible choice, my love. Stay here and risk your life, or give you up to save you. If I gave you to the state, you would become a ward, a number, a ghost. You would disappear into the system, and they would never find you. You would be safe. It was the hardest decision of my life. It broke my heart into 1,000,000 pieces. Leaving you at that facility, it was like tearing off my own arm. But I knew it was the only way to keep you alive. So I let you go. And I stayed here as the lonely old woman on the mountain, the guardian of this place. I kept paying the taxes. I set up the trust so this land would be yours, and only yours, when you were old enough to understand. I prayed every single day that you would be strong, that you would be safe, and that one day you would come back here. This place is your inheritance, Leo. It is more than land. It is your history. It is your sanctuary. In the filing cabinets you will find all of it. All of your parents' research, the original documents, the soil analyses, the videotaped testimony from the whistleblower who later disappeared. Everything you need to prove what Viridian did. You also have a choice. In the bottom drawer of this desk, there is a safe. The combination is your birthday. Inside, you will find the rest of the money your parents left. It is a substantial amount, enough for you to go anywhere in the world, to start a new life, to be safe and anonymous forever. You could take it and leave all this behind. No one would blame you. You have suffered enough. You owe them nothing. That is one path. The other path is to stay, to fight, to use what your parents gathered to expose Viridian and get justice for them, and for all the people they hurt. This path is dangerous. Viridian is more powerful now than ever. They will fight back. They will try to crush you, but you will not be alone. You have your parents' truth, and you have this place, your fortress. Whatever you choose, know this: I never abandoned you. Every moment I was away from you, I loved you. Giving you up was the only way I could protect you. This land, this archive, this was my final act of love. Be brave, my dear Leo, and be free. Siempre. Elena. The tape clicked off. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. I sat there, frozen, the letter in my hand. The world had just cracked open and rearranged itself. My entire life, my identity as an unwanted orphan, was a lie. It was a shield. My grandmother wasn't a faint, pleasant memory. She was a warrior. My parents weren't just deceased. They were heroes who had been murdered. And I wasn't an heir to nothing. I was the heir to a war. The grief I'd felt earlier was now mixed with a white-hot rage. Rage at Viridian, rage at the injustice, and an overwhelming, crushing wave of love for the grandmother who had sacrificed her own heart to save my life. My mind reeled, trying to process it all. The choice she laid out was stark. Disappear with the money and live in peace, or stay and fight a battle that had cost my parents their lives. Safety versus justice. Anonymity versus legacy. My hand went to the bottom drawer of the desk. I pulled it open. There was a small black metal safe. I turned the dial. My birthday. The door clicked open. Inside, stacked in neat, vacuum-sealed bundles, was cash. A lot of it. I didn't count it, but it had to be over $100,000. It was a ticket to anywhere. It was safety incarnate. I could walk out of this bunker, take the next bus to anywhere, and never think about Shale Pass or Viridian again. I could be free. Just as I was staring at the money, a buzzing sound vibrated through the desk. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My phone. Down here, deep underground, I had a signal. I looked at the ceiling and saw a small antenna array. Of course. Elena had thought of everything. The screen lit up with an unknown number. On a gut instinct, I answered it. Hello? Am I speaking with Mr. Leo Martinez? The voice was smooth, professional, and confident. The kind of voice that was used to getting what it wanted. Who is this? I asked, my own voice hoarse. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm with the Legal Acquisitions Department for the Viridian Terra Corporation. We believe you are the new owner of record for a 70-acre parcel in Shale Pass. The name hit me like a physical shock. Viridian. It was them. Already. I understand you've recently taken possession of the property, Vance continued, his voice slick as oil. It's a beautiful, rugged part of the country, but as I'm sure you're aware, the land itself has significant developmental challenges. No road access, no utilities, difficult terrain. And the property taxes can be quite a burden. I said nothing, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. We have a standing offer for the parcel, $15,000, which, frankly, is more than generous given the state of the property. However, my company feels that, given your circumstances, a young man starting out in the world, we'd like to help you get on your feet. We are prepared to increase our offer. Let's say $50,000, cash. We can have the paperwork and the money to you by the end of the week. $50,000, on top of the money in the safe. It was a fortune. It was a life of ease. All I had to do was say yes. Say yes and betray everything. Betray my parents. Betray Elena. Why do you want it so badly? I asked, my voice low and tight. If it's so worthless. There was a slight pause on the other end. We have long-term strategic interests in the region, Vance said, his voice a little colder now. Consolidating parcels. It's just business. It's not for sale, I said. The silence on the other end was heavy. I could almost feel his surprise, his annoyance. Mr. Martinez, he said, his tone shifting from friendly to menacing. Perhaps you should reconsider. That is a very lonely piece of land. Accidents can happen on mountain roads. It would be a tragedy for such a sad family story to have another unhappy ending. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The same promise they had delivered to my parents. He hung up. I dropped the phone on the desk. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The choice was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was here. They weren't just a faceless corporation in a letter from the past. They were on the other end of the phone. They knew who I was, and they were threatening me. I looked from the money in the safe to the box of evidence on the table. One represented escape. The other, a declaration of war. My grandmother said I owed them nothing. Maybe she was right. I had spent my entire life as a victim of circumstance, moved from place to place, powerless. Taking the money was a way to finally take control. But what kind of control would it be? A life spent looking over my shoulder? A life built on the foundation of my parents' murder and my grandmother's broken heart? This is the kind of moment that defines a life. Have you ever had one? A moment where you have to choose not between good and bad, but between the easy wrong and the hard right. Between what you want and who you are. If you've made it this far in the story, it's because some part of this resonates with you. You understand what it's like to be at a crossroads. I want to build a community here for people who get it, for people who have faced those choices. So take a moment and hit that subscribe button. Let's stick together. Now, back to the bunker. I sat there in the cold, silent office, the weight of $50,000 and a dead man's threat hanging in the air. I looked at the picture of my parents. They were so young, so full of hope. They believed they could make the world better. They died for that belief. Then I thought of Elena, alone in the shack above for 15 years, a silent sentinel guarding their legacy, waiting for me. She hadn't chosen the easy path. She had chosen the path of love and sacrifice. What had she called this place? Project Sanctuary, the archive. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a library of truth. It was an armory. She hadn't just left me a choice. She had left me a weapon. I closed the safe. I left the money inside. I walked over to the filing cabinets. I pulled open a drawer labeled Viridian Internal. It was filled with documents, memos, chemical formulas. I picked up a videotape. On the label, in my mother's handwriting, it said, Whistleblower Testimony, J. Peters. I could feel a shift inside me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But something else was growing alongside it, a slow, burning anger, a sense of purpose. For my entire life, I had been defined by what I had lost. My parents, my grandmother, a home, a history. But standing here, in this place built by love and defiance, I realized I hadn't just inherited a loss. I had inherited a mission. I wasn't Leo the orphan anymore. I wasn't a ward of the state. I was Leo Martinez, son of Elena and David. I was the grandson of Elena Rojas. This land, this bunker, this fight, this was my birthright. The choice was made. I spent the rest of that day and all through the night in the archive. I didn't sleep. Fueled by adrenaline and a pot of stale coffee I brewed in the small kitchen, I began to work. I went through the boxes, the files, the tapes. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking education. I read my father's scientific reports, his careful notes detailing the precise nature of the toxins Viridian was using. I saw the maps he had made, marking the dump sites, and cross-referenced them with public records of childhood cancer clusters in those same poor communities. The correlation was undeniable and horrifying. Then I watched the tapes. I saw my mother, professional and compassionate, interviewing families who had gotten sick, people whose wells were poisoned, but who were told it was just bad luck. Her anger was controlled, her questions precise. She was giving a voice to the voiceless. Finally, I watched the testimony of J. Peters, the whistleblower. He was a mid-level chemical engineer at Viridian, a man terrified for his life, his face in shadow. He laid out the entire conspiracy, the internal cover-up, the falsified safety reports, the executive-level orders. He provided documents that proved it all. By dawn, I knew the case better than anyone. I knew the science, I knew the victims, and I knew the criminals. This wasn't just a corporate malfeasance case, it was mass murder, orchestrated over decades. My fear hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer the paralyzing fear of the unknown. It was the sharp, focused fear of a soldier before a battle. I knew the enemy, I knew the stakes, and I knew my objective. My first call wasn't to a newspaper or the police. I knew Viridian had people everywhere. My first call was to Ms. Albright. I caught her early, just as she was getting to her office.
"Leo, is that you? Where are you? Are you all right?"
Her voice was a flurry of professional concern. "I'm fine, Ms. Albright," I said, my own voice sounding calmer and older than it had just 2 days ago. "I'm on the property, and I'm not selling." There was a pause.
"Leo, what's going on? I got a call yesterday from a lawyer representing Viridian Terra. He was asking questions about you. He sounded aggressive."
"I know. He called me too. He threatened me." I heard her sharp intake of breath.
"What did he say?" "Leo, maybe you should just take the money and go. This is out of your depth."
"It's always been my depth," I said. "I just didn't know it. Ms. Albright, I need help. Not a social worker. I need a lawyer, a real one, a bulldog. Someone who isn't afraid of a fight with a billion-dollar corporation." I could hear her typing on her computer. I might know someone," she said slowly, her tone shifting. The weary pragmatism was gone, replaced by a cautious intrigue. "He's a semi-retired public interest attorney, specializes in environmental law. He's taken on some big companies and won. He owes me a favor. His name is Samuel Jones." "Is he trustworthy?" "He's the most stubborn, incorruptible man I've ever met," she said. "He's also a pain in the ass. He'll want to know everything, and he'll only take the case if it's solid." "It's solid," I said, looking around the archive at the mountains of proof my parents had died to collect. "Tell him I have the original files from the Rojas and Martinez case against Viridian." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "My God," she whispered. "I remember that case. It was 20 years ago. It just disappeared." Everyone assumed the evidence was lost. It wasn't lost, I said. It was waiting. That afternoon, I began the work of reclaiming my home. I climbed out of the bunker, back into the bright, clean mountain air. The world looked different. The harsh, rocky land no longer seemed worthless. It seemed like a fortress. The tall pines were sentinels. The silence was my shield. I went back to the shack. It was still a wreck, but now I didn't see decay. I saw potential. I spent hours tearing out the rotten floorboards on the porch, my muscles aching, sweat stinging my eyes. I found a pile of old lumber stacked behind the shack, weathered but still strong. I found a toolbox, rusty but functional. I started rebuilding the steps, one by one. The work was hard and real. Every swing of the hammer, every nail I drove, felt like an act of defiance. I wasn't just fixing a porch, I was putting down roots. Later that day, a dusty pickup truck rumbled up the dirt road. It was Sarah from the general store. She got out, holding a cardboard box. "Figured you might need this," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of jam, a block of cheese, and a thermos of hot coffee. "Heard you were staying. Saw you were working." I was speechless. Thank you." "Elena was a good woman," she said simply, looking at the work I'd done on the porch. "Quiet, but strong. This place deserves to have life in it again." She looked out at the vast expanse of the valley. "Viridian's been trying to buy up this whole mountain. They want to build one of those exclusive resorts for rich folks from the city. Golf courses, spas, the whole thing. They say it'll bring jobs, but most of us know it'll just ruin the place. A lot of folks have sold. They offer money that people can't afford to turn down." She looked at me, her sharp blue eyes serious. "But some of us are holding out. This mountain has a history. It doesn't belong to them." She didn't ask what I was doing. She didn't need to. In her simple act of kindness, in her quiet words of support, I felt the first stirrings of a community. I wasn't entirely alone on this mountain. That night, I didn't sleep in the perfect, sterile safety of the bunker. I dragged the old mattress from the shack out onto the newly repaired porch. I lay there under the vast, star-dusted sky, the likes of which I'd never seen in the city. The air was cold and crisp. The sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl were a lullaby. I thought about the word inheritance. Before, it was a legal term, an abstract concept. I thought I had inherited 70 acres of wasteland. Then I thought I had inherited a secret and a burden. But as I lay there, on the porch of the shack my grandmother had lived in, looking out at the land my parents had died to protect, I finally understood. My inheritance wasn't the land itself, or the bunker, or even the money in the safe. It was the story. It was the legacy of courage and conviction. My grandmother hadn't just given me a place to hide. She had given me a place to stand. My parents hadn't just left me evidence. They had left me a purpose. Home isn't just 4 walls and a roof. Sometimes, home is a mission. Sometimes it's a promise you make to the ghosts of the people you love. It's the choice to turn a place of abandonment into a place of belonging, to transform a legacy of pain into a source of strength. The shack was dilapidated, the land was wild, and the fight ahead was terrifying. But for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was home. The legal battle has just begun. Samuel Jones, the lawyer Ms. Albright found, turned out to be exactly as advertised: stubborn, brilliant, and utterly fearless. He drove up here himself a week after my call. He spent 2 days in the archive, his eyes alight with a fire I recognized. The fire of a man who lives for the fight for justice. He took the case. He said it was the case of his lifetime. Viridian's threats have become more formal, more menacing. Official letters from their lawyers, surveillance vehicles parked at the bottom of my road. But I am not afraid, not in the same way. The fear is a tool now. It keeps me sharp. I spend my days working on the land, making the shack livable, and my nights in the archive, helping Sam's team organize 2 decades of evidence. Sarah brings me supplies once a week. Sometimes she brings her husband, a quiet man who helped me fix the roof. They don't ask questions, they just show up. They are my community. My inheritance wasn't 70 acres of wasteland. It was a choice. It was the chance to become the man my parents and grandmother believed I could be. It was a second chance, forged in sacrifice and love. The world had tried to tell me I was nothing, a leftover, a piece of administrative debris. But they were wrong. I am a son and a grandson, and I have work to do. What about you? What has life handed you that looked like a burden but was actually a gift? What story is waiting for you to claim it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories matter. They are a part of this community we're building. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe in fighting for what's right even when it's hard, then hit that subscribe button. Because this fight is far from over, and this is just the beginning of the story.